In 1249, Pope Innocent IV condemns the accusation of ritual murder, but the prejudices and superstitions linger into modern times. Time and again, wandering preachers incite the people. For them, Jews are heretics. They like to invoke the New Testament and report full of disgust that Judas betrayed Jesus for money. Fanatical preachers claim that the Jews repeat this murder of God at least once a year. They claim that they will take a knife and stab it through the Christian communion hosts until they bleed. Popularly, this claim is taken as proof for the real transformation of bread into the body of Christ during the Christian Holy Communion, just as the Pope had proclaimed as church dogma in 1215.
This makes for a very powerful form of hatred and suspicion which has pursued the Jewish peoples down the centuries. So we really have two threats. We have the ritual crucifixion, we have the blood libel, we then have also too the association of Jews with the devil and indeed with Antichrist, and a hugely built suspicion against the Jews, which in times of poverty, allied with money lending, can come together to bring pogroms, to bring massacres upon the Jewish people.
During the 13th century, the portrayal of the Jews becomes more and more base. The so-called Jewish pig becomes a popular motif. It finds its way into churches as reliefs or wood carvings, as here in the choir stalls of Cologne Cathedral. Jews despise the pig as unclean. Christians consider it the carrier of devils and demons. The Jewish pig became the symbol of ostracism. The popes don't support this hunt against the Jews. They mostly invoke the church teacher Augustine, who demanded protection for the Jews on the grounds that they were contemporary witnesses of Christ. If Jews were to live in poverty and humility, their lives and property wouldn't be endangered. Decisions from Rome regulate coexistence between Jews and Christians. They became a part of secular legal codes, like, for example, the Sachsenspiel, the most important book of law of the Middle Ages. The amount of interest that the Jewish moneylenders are allowed to charge is limited. Jews have to distinguish themselves from Christians through special clothing in order to prevent too close contact. The Jews are meant to wear a special badge, as is the custom amongst other classes. The yellow circle only becomes established in the late Middle Ages, partly because of the strong resistance by the Jews. Since the middle of the 13th century, the Church has aimed its attacks specifically at the religious writings of the Jews. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX condemns the Talmud as blasphemous. The accusation is that it goes against Christianity. 24 cartloads of Jewish texts are burned in Paris. Rabbi Meir ben Baruch composes an elegy at the time that is still part of Jewish mourning liturgy today. Ask about the welfare of the grieving, burned in the flames, desiring to live in the court of thy holy house, but are dragged through the dust of the earth, and are suffering, shaken by the burning of thy scrolls. Meir ben Baruch is from Rothenburg ob der Tauber, which is also home to an important Jewish community. The Jews are an important source of income for the town. The Rothenburg Jewish Book contains royal and episcopal records, naturalization documents, debt certificates from Christian citizens, but also tax records and receipts of the payments of the golden sacrificial penny. This is introduced by the Bavarian king Ludwig III in 1342. Every Jew over the age of 12 with a fortune of 20 guilders has to pay 1 guilder every year. In return, the city officials promise protection. A few years later, this promise is forgotten. The plague reaches Europe. A third of the population die at the hands of the Black Death. The plague doesn't distinguish whether rich or poor, man, woman or child, all die within a few hours. And the Jewish population isn't spared either. Nobody knew the causes at this time. For many, the plague is a punishment from God for all the earthly sins. Fear spreads through Europe. That the plague is spread by rats and fleas wasn't yet known. For the Jews, the rat is the symbol for death and disease because it fed on filth. An amulet of the time is a possible indication that Jewish doctors suspected rats to be the cause. It carries the Hebraic inscription, To hell with you. A deadly rumour is going around. Jews and heretics are to blame for the plague. They're said to have poisoned the wells. For many, this is a welcome pretext to rid themselves of their debts with the Jewish moneylenders. The Chateau de Chalon on Lake Geneva in Switzerland becomes the torture chamber for countless Jews in September 1348. They are accused of having conspired to destroy the Christians with the help of the Black Death. Under torture, a Jew confesses to having poisoned the wells in Venice in order to start the plague. The forced confession is proclaimed throughout Europe. What happened next is described by a witness of the time. That's why all Hebrews, young men, women, aged and very old people, were killed between Cologne and Austria. Pope Clement VI attempts to contain this mass mania of 1348. He points out that the supposed well poisoners are also falling victim to the plague. His words have no effect. Growing discontent, economic uncertainty and the fear of the plague all express themselves in the hatred of the Jews. Without a doubt, the Jews were the eternal foreigners in Europe. They were tolerated, accepted, but as foreigners. That was their role in relaxed times as well as in times of crisis. And in times of crisis, the foreigner becomes the scapegoat in order to explain the unexplainable. We've seen the same phenomenon in modern history. In April 1349, the pogrom wave reaches Erfurt. Even the best relations of the Jews with the Christian upper class are of no use anymore. The citizens of Erfurt have already begun to storm the houses of the Jews. They aren't just looking for their inhabitants, but also for property. A Jewish merchant hurriedly buries some treasure, possibly his own, but perhaps the collective property of the community. A good 650 years later, archaeologists were to find the treasure during excavations in the medieval Jewish quarter. It was to be a discovery of great significance. Hardly anything comparable has survived from that time in Germany. On the wedding ring it says, Mazel Tov, which is Hebrew for good luck. More than 3,000 coins helped with dating. It was the time of the plague. The Jewish businessman and his family leave Erfurt. Tens of thousands of Jews are driven out or murdered. An unknown canon of Constance Cathedral wrote, I think that the people and the seed of Abraham will live on the other side of the sea rather than in this country, and that's why I'm closing the chapter on the Jews. For 400 Jewish communities in Central Europe, the plague persecution signifies the end. Only a few Jewish settlements remain in Central Europe. The glorious era in Ashkenazi is over. In the south, on the Iberian Peninsula, the situation also changes for the Jews during this time. Though once well respected by the Muslim rulers, now they are at best merely tolerated. Because the Reconquista, the reconquest by the Christians, is putting the Muslims under pressure. Jews find themselves the victims of assaults. When Ferdinand III, the King of Castile, arrives in Seville, the Jews gain hope. They welcome the Christian king as a liberator and promise themselves tolerance and peace through him. As a sign of welcome and trust, the Jewish community leader presents the king with symbolic keys. Today they lie in the Cathedral of Seville. On one of them is written in Hebrew letters, "The King of Kings shall open, the King of Kings shall enter." The inscriptions on the sarcophagus of Ferdinand III are in two languages, Hebrew and Arabic. Jews and Muslims showed the Christian monarch respect, a unique symbol of peaceful coexistence. Toledo is an important cultural centre in Christian Spain. In the 14th century, 1 inhabitant in 3 is a Jew. Today's church of Santa Maria la Blanca was a synagogue at that time. The building speaks of the cultural blending. It was built in the 13th century. It was a synthesis of Caliphic and Romanesque art, the Mudejar style. The Jews are welcome to the new rulers as mediators between Muslims and Christians. They know the country, speak Arabic and are experienced in administration. Toledo is a magnet for Europe's intellectuals. Muslim, Jewish and Christian scholars all work here together. The city becomes the centre for the study of ancient scriptures and for their translation into Latin, because many texts of ancient philosophers, like Aristotle for example, had only survived in Arabic. Thanks to Jewish translators, these writings were now accessible to the Latin-speaking Christian monks and professors in Europe. This way, Jewish intellectuals and linguists provide an important contribution to the science and culture of the Christian West.
The translation movement is an example of positive interaction between Jews and Christians in a period when we don't usually think of there being a great deal. Whether you can generalize from that to saying that Jews and Christians got along well, I don't know. On an individual basis, certainly arrangements like that were often made.
In Girona, 100 kilometers from Barcelona, there is also an important Jewish community to which many intellectuals belong. The Jews live here in their own quarter called Kalam, the Hebrew for community. The former Jewish quarter of Girona is still one of the most impressive in Europe. It has remained nearly unchanged for 500 years. Rabbis went to the synagogue and the boys went to their school, the yeshiva, through these streets. From the outside, the houses of the Jews hardly differed from those of their Christian neighbours. The only distinguishing feature was an indentation on the right side of the door frame. This was where the mezuzah used to be, which is Hebrew for doorpost. It has been credited with very different meanings. The mezuzah doesn't have any magical or ritual significance. It simply stands for following God's law. God's law says that the mezuzah should be attached to the doors of their houses to remind them of God's word in important moments. As in the rest of Europe, pressure on the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula increases during the 13th century. Anti-Jewish propaganda is spreading. The Catholic clergy preach against the Jewish religion, see in it a threat to Christianity that has to be dealt with. During this time, a strange ritual developed amongst the priests of Girona and their students. Every year at Easter, they would climb the cathedral tower. From there, they would throw stones into the Jewish quarter. Only when the king threatened the bishop to make him responsible for the behaviour does he put an end to it. But the Jews continue to be persecuted. Accusations of ritual murder also reach the Christian kingdoms of Spain. Paintings and miniatures from the time show Jews more and more as enemies of Christianity and as disciples of the devil. With oversized noses, they are also caricatured as the embodiment of greed.
In Christian Europe, Jews stood out as being very different. Jews appeared as a kind of foreign body in the Christian world. From a religious point of view, Christians very often thought of them as sorcerers or dangerous figures because they seemed to have weird religious rituals and weird behavior, which in the Islamic world didn't seem so weird. It seemed much more natural. It was much closer to the Islamic way of life.
For the Jews, a time of uncertainty begins, and this is also true in the former Muslim Seville. Jacob ibn Habib is one of the best-known Jewish scholars in Seville at the end of the 15th century. As an influential man, he has enjoyed the respect of his fellow citizens of all religions for years, but he too becomes more uncertain. He was worried about his son. He wanted to protect him from hatred, disfavour and assaults from his Christian neighbours. Worried, he forbids him to play outside the house. Many of his relatives and friends give in to the pressure out of fear and convert to Christianity. For him and his family, that isn't an option. He stands by his faith and isn't intimidated by anyone. But thousands of Jews convert and thereby face Spanish society with an unexpected problem.
All those positions that had been closed to Jews when they were Jews were now open to them because they were Christian. And so much to the nightmare of many Spaniards, former Jews were now rising in the courts, even in the church, in medicine, in the universities, and the feeling began to spread that these weren't really Christians at all.
The conversions also bring unrest into the Jewish community. They split families and friends. Everyone is asking the question, who is a Jew and who is not? Everyone could be a spy of the Christians. Jacob ibn Habib won't tolerate a converted Jew in his presence, particularly not at a Jewish celebration, not even a relative. The cross, the symbol of the Christians, has no place in his home. Ferdinand and Isabella, whose marriage united Spain and who together are known as the Catholic Kings, persecute those of a different faith with particular harshness. In 1478 they introduced the Inquisition in Spain with the permission of the Pope. Tomás de Torquemada became the notorious Grand Inquisitor. Up until his death, 15 years later, more than 100,000 people are subjected to the Inquisition's methods. Tens of thousands of Jews who've converted to Christianity are tortured in dungeons and subsequently burned at the stake as heretics. Admitting to not being a true Christian was only a matter of time under torture. The trial documents can still be seen in the Historical National Archive in Madrid today. Hundreds of thousands of names and destinies are documented there. Auto de fe, or act of faith, was the name given to the public execution of the sentence. For most, it ended in death. It is the aim of the inquisitors to protect the Christians from the allegedly corrupting influence of the Jews.
Was Jewishness the criterion, or was Judaism? Was the essence of this convert his ethnicity, his lineage, his ancestry, or was it his practice as a religious personality? And the answer that Spaniards in the 15th century came up with was a racial answer. It was the blood, regardless of the religious practice, that determined who was a Jew.
The new theory of limpieza de sangre, purity of the blood, was only implemented in the 16th century, but it already influenced the mood towards the Jews before that. In January 1492, the last Islamic bastion falls with the conquest of Granada by the Christians. On March the 31st, Ferdinand and Isabella sign a document in the Alhambra that seals the fate of thousands. We order that all Jews, irrespective of age, leave our kingdoms and fiefdoms by the end of the month of July, and they are prohibited to return here or to any such places to live there or to remain there temporarily. Breaking this decree is punishable by death and the loss of their entire property. 300,000 Jews have to leave Spain within 3 months forever. A great exodus begins. In the last days of July 1492, Jacob ibn Habib also has to leave Seville. Like many, he hopes that he will soon be allowed to return. He wants to go to Portugal with his family. There, Jews are still welcome, it is said. The Jews had lived on the Iberian Peninsula for 1,500 years. Proud of their origin, they call themselves Sephardim, after Sepharad, the Hebrew name for Spain. A glorious era was over. While the Jews were leaving their home, Christopher Columbus was on his way to an unknown continent. On board with him were also converted Jews. Antwerp, Europe's biggest port, provides a safe refuge, for example, for Doña Gracia Mendes. Doña Gracia was a Jew who had been forcibly baptized. She had to pray in secret. To the outside, she was a Christian. Not even her own sister, Brianda, a staunch Christian, was allowed to know what she really believed. Doña Gracia inherited an influential banking and trading empire from her husband. She had connections all over Europe, but nobody was safe from the Spanish inquisitors. The horror stories she was told by her parents haunted her. Her family got baptized for fear of persecution, but in the eyes of the Christian community they were still only marranos, pigs, a despised and tortured minority. Everyone was suspected of secretly following the old faith. Torture forced a confession out of everyone, and that was punished by death. Now the Inquisition also reached Antwerp. Again, flight was the only option. Venice, the new world power, was considered a safe haven. The city had the reputation of opening its gates to all refugees. Whether of a different faith or not, here you were a Venetian and merchant first and foremost, but then also a Christian. As a businesswoman with international connections, Doña Gracia was welcome here. The Doges appreciated any capital. A Jewish manuscript from the time illustrates religious and everyday life. Jews were intellectuals, physicians and musicians at the Italian courts. They wore elegant, fashionable clothing and did not speak the languages they brought with them, but Italian. But they were only tolerated as long as the powerful profited from them. Donna Grazia lived beside the Grand Canal in the Palazzo Gritti, an exclusive address then as it is now. It was opposite the Ottoman Trading Centre, one of her business partners. She was living the life of a Christian, but in Venice she had the opportunity to meet avowed Jews for the first time. In the ghetto of Venice, they were allowed to openly live their faith. The ghetto had only just been created. The church insisted that Jews be separated from the Christian population, so they were driven off onto a marshy island that, in those days, lay on the outskirts of the city. This was where the metal casters worked. The new quarter was named after them, ghetto, from the Italian word gettare, to cast. The name established itself, and soon the word ghetto was used for any closed Jewish city quarter. Jewish refugees were pouring into Venice. Soon the ghetto was overflowing. In order to create more living space, more stories were built. To this day, the houses in the ghetto are the highest in Venice. After sundown, the bridges are closed off and the barriers lowered down, but still it is the place where the Jews of Venice have a right to live in safety for the first time. The quarter kept its character right into the 20th century, until the Nazis deported all Jews from Venice in 1944. After the end of fascism, only a few of the survivors returned to this place. Donna Grazia enters her religious home with a pounding heart. Hide your cross, she warns her sister Brianda. Forcibly baptized Jews were viewed with suspicion here as well. They were like a boat without paddles, on the borders between the religions. The two sisters had different feelings about this Jewish world that they only knew from the stories of their parents. Brianda, the faithful Christian, is feeling uneasy. Donna Grazia, the secret Jew, is experiencing curiosity, perhaps even longing. The conflict of the two religions drives a wedge between the two sisters. Brianda comes up with a deceitful plan. The business people in Venice always ask, what's new on the Rialto? On the Rialto, money flows like water. The Pope has forbidden Christians to lend money at interest, but Venice, a financial centre, makes its own laws. Christian banks give big credits to rich merchants, and an annual interest rate of 50% is not considered extortionate. The applicants that don't promise a profit are sent to the ghetto. The Jewish moneylenders are forced to give small credits even to the poor for only 5% interest, an officially decreed social policy for the benefit of the Christian underclass. Venice needs the Jews as it needs bakers, it was said. Donna Grazia is visiting her Jewish banker. She has a particular concern. Secretly, she is donating money to the Jewish refugees from Spain and Portugal for the construction of new houses of worship. As a result, she makes a name for herself amongst the Jews. One day, she decides to go to the synagogue of the Spanish Jews. It's the first time that she's entered a Jewish house of worship. There are treasures and splendor wherever she looks. The beauty of the building and of the Jewish cult shine beyond the ghetto's borders and attract even Christian visitors. Even here, Donna Grazia prays in secret because the reach of the Inquisition is long.
The world of the Marrano was of the secret Jew was a world of deception. It was a world also in which deception of the Marrano could be fatal. In other words, somebody who was secretly practicing Judaism could be betrayed by anyone with a particular gripe, anybody who had personal issues or a vendetta.
In 1547, the Inquisition also reaches Venice under pressure from the Pope. Business is booming for informers. Donna Grazia's sister Brianda also becomes a traitor. She tells the tribunal that Donna Grazia is secretly practicing the Jewish religion. The proof? A Hebrew book of prayer decorated with the family's coat of arms. And in addition, she says, her sister is planning to flee from Venice with her entire fortune. Immediately, a warrant of arrest is issued for Dona Gracia. The Catholic Church has always been particularly severe with apostate Christians. In Europe, another religious war is being waged, one that is shaking the Church to its foundations. The trigger was an Augustinian monk in distant Wittenberg in Germany. Martin Luther also has a difficult relationship with the Jews. To start with, he still defends them against Christian prejudices. In his manuscript, that Jesus was a Jew by birth, he emphasizes the Jewish roots of Christianity. Luther hopes to convert the Jews to the new faith, but the zeal of the Protestant missionaries is not enough. The friend of the Jew becomes their enemy. Then he writes, "On the Jews and their lies. They are," he says, "poisonous, bitter, rapacious, malicious enemies of the Christians, a pestilence and plague that needs to be exterminated." That's terribly tragic, because Luther developed a real program of Jew hatred, how people were supposed to go about it. He even went so far as to say that not only did they spread their lies in the synagogues, but also in their homes, which meant that all their houses should be torn down, because they spread their lies there too. And there was a terrible moment with Luther where he claimed that the Jews had a pact with the devil. These are arguments and ideas that he spread, and that were still around during the Nazi time, and even later. The connection of Judaism with Satan and how people are supposed to treat them. Jews are caught in the middle of the religious wars. For all that the Protestants and Catholics are fighting each other, they agree on one point: their hatred of the Jews. The Jews turn increasingly to the east. Constantinople, the city on the Bosphorus, becomes the new destination of their hopes. Thousands looked for a refuge here, far away from the Christian sphere of influence. Tolerant sultans rule from the Topkapi Palace. They realize that Jews bring a lot of money and new knowledge from Europe with them. The Christian rulers make their countries poorer and enrich ours instead, they say in wonder. Dona Gracia manages to flee from Venice. The Sultan welcomes her in a private audience and pays her his respect. He doesn't make her drop to her knees, the sign of subordination. The woman of another faith has a huge fortune and worldwide economic contacts. Dona Gracia takes advantage of the ruler's favor. She asks him to extend the borders of his realm even further. She puts her own wealth behind this good deed.
Her story, the mythology about her, her example of loyalty to her people was such that she became the subject of myth, of song. Synagogues that she endowed even today in Istanbul as well, still called the synagogue of La Signora, Hagveret, of the woman. And everybody knows when you say La Signora that you're referring to Dona Gracia Mendes.
Dona Gracia becomes a helper for refugees. She hires powerful ships and builds a network of helpers. She's able to save hundreds of Jews. They are safe in Constantinople. Out of gratitude and as a constant reminder of their rescue, the refugees build a synagogue with a special prayer pulpit in the shape of a ship. The descendants of the escapees still honor the tradition. From the 16th century to this day, the Jewish community has been living in safety and peace with its Islamic neighbors. During the 16th century, the Jewish community in the Ottoman Empire was the largest in the world. Here, Jews were able to live unhindered and honor their religious traditions. Where you are welcome, you don't have to isolate yourself. Many Jews adapt to the culture of their Oriental surroundings. And this culture learns from its guests. The refugees bring a new invention from Europe with them: printing. Jewish specialists don't just print their own religious texts, but also the first books of Islam. Dona Gracia has the Bible translated into Spanish and reproduced. Now the forcibly baptized Jews are able to follow the religion of their fathers again. The first edition is dedicated to her. Even during her lifetime, this courageous woman is honored as the savior of her people, in poems and song. She became your proven pillar during your weakness, a bench on which the tired could find rest, like a shady tree under which the despairing could recover. After a nearly 20-year odyssey, Dona Gracia finds peace. In Constantinople, she's able to practice her faith freely and without fear of persecution. On this particular Friday, she is celebrating the Sabbath, and, as is the Jewish custom, she pleads for the blessing of her family and her tortured people. God has saved her from many dangers, and often she was his hand, so she believes, when she was able to help the persecuted, and when she was donating money for schools, orphanages, and synagogues. Now she's dreaming of a return to the Promised Land, like many faithful Jews. Perhaps her grave is on the Mount of Olives outside the gates of Jerusalem, there where her husband also lies buried. Here Doña Gracia's trail runs cold. In Jerusalem, Constantinople and Venice, the Spanish Jews, the Sephardim, find a new home. The Ashkenazi Jews in France and Germany are also looking for a safe haven. They are fleeing from persecution, poverty and oppression further and further towards the east. Their hope is Poland. The widower, Samuel Leibush from Regensburg, joins a refugee trek together with his daughter Rachel. An old Jewish legend lends them courage. At one time, Jews were said to have received a letter from heaven. It said, Polin, in English, dwell here. That's how Poland got its name, the Jewish immigrants tell themselves. Poland, an underdeveloped agrarian country in desperate need of craftsmen and business people. Would Samuel make his fortune as a goldsmith and coiner? His destination is Krakow. For centuries, Jews and Christians have lived in peace around the marketplace. The new arrivals are protected by royal privileges. They're allowed to practice their religion, purchase homes and land, and engage in unrestricted trading. Krakow becomes the spiritual center of Judaism in Europe. The Jewish intellectuals are in close communication with the University of Krakow, which was built in the middle of the Jewish quarter during the 14th century. In Poland, the Jews are also permitted to become craftsmen. As shoemakers, tailors, goldsmiths, and as furriers, they are even organized in their own guilds. Right into the 20th century, these were typically Jewish occupations. What will the future hold in store for Rachel? In Krakow, she's safe from persecution. But as the only daughter, she has to run the household for her father and help out on the market until she gets married. In those days, there was compulsory education only for Jewish boys. Samuel Leibush manages to make himself indispensable to the aristocracy as a supplier of luxury gold and silver goods. Like many Jews, he now also belongs to the country's new middle class, between the peasantry and the nobility. The close relationship to the nobility also finds its expression in clothing. The Jews adopt the dress of the Polish nobility during the 17th century, when the latter start dressing in the Western fashion, the black silk kaftan, the streimel, a voluminous fur hat made of sable, white stockings and buckled shoes. To this day, one group of religious Jews, the Hasidim, still wear this dress. This way they maintain the memory of their ancestors and the dream of a better life everywhere in the world. The Polish kings who guarantee the Jews protection and privileges rule from Wawel Castle. They called Jews to their backward country to develop it and promote trade. Casimir the Great was considered their special patron in the 14th century. His unrequited love for the beautiful Jewess Esther is said to have been his motive. Did this love really exist? What is certain is that the king needed the Jews. With this document, he gave the Jews land when they were driven out of Krakow by the envious Christians. On the other river bank opposite his castle, the Jewish settlement of Kazimierz was built. And this time, the Christians are forbidden to live here for the protection of the Jews. The Jewish inhabitants live in peace for a long time after their persecution and oppression in Western Europe. Samuel Leibush is a witness to a robbery and turns to the municipal council. The Jews of Kazimierz have their own municipal rights and their own administration, a situation unique in Europe during the 16th century. The Kahal, a council made up of rabbis and community elders, address all public questions. It doesn't just deal with judicial issues, but also collects the community's taxes and deals with the care of the sick and elderly. The accused had broken one of the 10 Commandments, "Thou shalt not steal." He is convicted under Jewish law, the halakha. For thousands of years it's been regulating religious and social life and is constantly being adapted to everyday life. The punishment for theft is dependent on the severity of the offence. The pillory in the anteroom of the synagogue, a ban on exercising one's profession, prison, or even exclusion from the community are all possible punishments. Kazimierz remained one of the largest and most significant Jewish communities in Europe for 600 years. People live in close proximity in the streets and squares all around the synagogue, because according to Jewish law, a Jew is not allowed to walk more than 1,000 meters from his house to the synagogue. In the atmosphere of freedom and economic success, the shtetl developed. The unique culture of Eastern European Jewry with its own customs, its own language, Yiddish, and its own music, klezmer. Klezmer comes from the Hebrew for musical instrument. The klezmorim, the musicians, had been moving from village to village since the Middle Ages, playing at weddings and religious festivals, melodies full of melancholy and at the same time full of cheerfulness. Jewish life in Krakow was extinguished, destroyed by National Socialist mass murder. Nearly 3.5 million Jews were living in Poland before World War II. The Star of David stands for the unity and strength of the Jewish community. Its history began in Prague around the mid-14th century. In the small streets surrounding the castle, the Jews of Prague also enjoyed the favour of the ruler. For the first time in Jewish history, they received the right to have their own flag, a sign of strength and independence. The community had a 6-pointed star sewn onto the flag, formed by 2 triangles. The triangle recalls the Greek letter delta, the initial of the biblical King David. The Star of David became the symbol of the Jews in Prague. They decorated their private and religious objects with it, like the synagogue candelabra. From Prague, the Star of David spread to all Jewish communities in Europe. The common symbol created unity in a people that was living dispersed in many countries. It is said that the Jews proudly carried the flag for the first time in the 30 Years' War, when in 1648 the Protestant Swedes besieged Prague. A Jewish unit defended the city together with the Catholics. Nothing unites better than a common threat. In memory of this event, a copy of this flag still hangs in what is known as the Altneuschule, or Old New Synagogue in Prague. 300 years later, during the Nazi era, all Jews were forced to wear a yellow star. The Star of David became a symbol of exclusion and annihilation. At the founding of the State of Israel, it was put back on the flag again. Despite everything, the symbol of strength had survived. Symbols and legends were a source of hope and the ability to survive, just like the story of Rabbi Judah Löw from Prague, whose grave is still visited by many pilgrims today. With the help of Jewish mysticism, the rabbi is said to have created a creature made of clay, the golem, a soulless creature with supernatural powers that was meant to protect the Jews of Prague from their persecutors. A silent film of the 1920s spread the legend to the world. A note with the Hebrew name of God awakened the golem to life. In the film, the longed-for Saviour became a monster and turned on his creator in the Jewish community. Rabbi Löw had to destroy him. The original idea of this legend was actually a different one. You can see quite clearly here how a dream of a saviour figure that protects the Jews arose, a hero who helped the intellectual Rabbi Löw and thereby prevented ritual murder and other similar atrocities, such as expulsion from Prague. That had a very strong symbolic power, such a saviour figure, which you can see from the success of this legend and from the motif of the golems as saviour figures of the community that was brought into children's books from the 19th century to this day. Back in the 17th century, many Jews are moving further east, in search of peace and prosperity. Their destination is the Polish-Lithuanian Aristocratic Republic. They are more than just tolerated here. A Jewish four-country council is allowed to make laws and administrate the community, like a state within a state. Particularly, the still undeveloped northeast of the state in modern-day Ukraine is considered a land of boundless opportunity. The Jewish writer Joseph Roth wrote, "The Eastern Jews don't have a home anywhere, but graves in every cemetery." The art historian Andrei Czesinski reads tombstones like history books. He finds surprising proof for the attractiveness of this religion in those times. I discovered the grave of a Jewish man on which it said, "I am a refugee from the land of the Sephardim, a refugee from Spain whose family took another dangerous journey upon themselves. So great was the attractive power of this region." The researcher has also found traces of one of the most horrific massacres in the history of the Eastern European Jews. The abrupt end of a period of prosperity can be dated exactly 1648. A chronicler records the unfolding of the drama in all its details. Rabbi Nathan Hanover from the Ostro in the Ukraine was the son of a refugee from Hanover. He kept asking himself how fondness could turn to such hatred. He called his chronicle Yevon Mezula, at the abyss of despair. The coexistence of the Jews and the Christians was never entirely free of conflict in Poland and the Ukraine. Nathan Hanover watched with concern how the situation was coming to a head, particularly on the payday of the Ukrainian peasants. They have to give more than half of their already miserly income to their masters, the landed nobility. They prefer to use Jews to collect the taxes because they have the reputation of being adept businessmen. For the Christian villagers, this is an outrageous provocation. Even though both religions have been living side by side for centuries, the Jews always remained outsiders for many Christians because of their language, Yiddish, their clothing and their religion. The Christians are suspicious about the good contacts of the Jews with the powerful, as administrators and tenants of the country estates. Meanwhile, the Polish princes are living in European cities such as London or Paris. The Ukrainian peasants are the ones who have to finance this extravagant lifestyle. Nathan Hanover wrote, "They were so tortured and oppressed that even the lowest classes became their masters. They became the slaves of the Polish gentry and of the Jews." Slowly, the hatred began to grow, a ticking time bomb. In 1648, a war breaks out and the Jews are caught in the firing line. Bogdan Chmielnicki, leader of the Ukrainian Cossacks, allies himself with the peasants in a national revolt against foreign Polish rule. They aren't able to fight the nobility, so they turn their weapons on their Jewish administrators, and so against all Jews, both rich and poor. The revolt spreads like wildfire. More and more Ukrainian peasants join the uprising. Everywhere, Jewish towns and villages are being burned. Chmielnicki moves through Poland, Lithuania and the Ukraine for an entire year, killing and plundering wherever he goes. The news reaches Ostrov, the village of Nathan Hanover. Like many, he closes his eyes to the events and hopes that his community will be spared by the grace of God. And where could they go anyway? Nathan has to watch the atrocities committed against men, women and children. Some were skinned alive and their flesh thrown to the dogs to eat. Others had their hands and arms hacked off and their bodies thrown onto the streets so that they were trampled by the horses. There was no murderous cruelty that the enemies didn't commit. Only a few survive in the shelter of synagogues built like fortresses, houses of worship with thick walls and watchtowers. To this day they recall the threat and persecution of that time. Hundreds of thousands are killed, including Nathan's father. Nathan Hanover himself is able to flee to the safety of Italy. There he publishes his chronicle. The heinous crimes done to his people must never be forgotten. The massacre pushed the entire Eastern European Jewry into a dramatic crisis. 300 villages were snuffed out. It was the end of a long era of security, peace and success. The survivors fled in panic. Never again would they see their Polish homeland, and once again thousands of Jews were searching for a safe place. Travellers and business people had said that Amsterdam provided protection and freedom. Wherever a Jew was in need of help, he must be helped. That is a sacred duty, as it was for Glickel von Hameln, who wrote in her diary, "My nephew was a respected man in Poland, but after the war he came to us with his wife and daughter without anything." Her memoirs are the first written memories of a Jewish woman. She was the wife of a gem trader, and so she was able to help her poor relatives. In Amsterdam, Glickel asks a marriage broker to find a husband for her eldest daughter. Decisive for a good catch are the family tree and their fortune. It's an investment for the future, not only because of business connections. In times of persecution, it could be life-saving to have relatives in a safe place. 17th century Amsterdam has this advantage. Since 1579, it has had a law stating that nobody may be persecuted because of their faith. It is also a safe haven for Jewish refugees from Spain and Poland. Mokum, place, is what they call the town on the Amstel, in which they were to live in peace for the next 300 years. These days, the people of Amsterdam still call their city Mokum. Amsterdam is a powerful economic centre. More goods are traded here than anywhere else in Europe. The Spanish Jews are esteemed as global players. They speak many languages and have worldwide trading contacts. Jews import diamonds from India. This trade has been in Jewish hands since the 8th century. Jewish moneylenders accept the precious stones as security. They're easily hidden and transported during travel or flight. Glickel von Hameln was dealt a fortunate hand. In the 3 weeks that we were in Amsterdam before the wedding, we managed to earn the dowry. To this day, Jewish dealers influence the diamond business. The elaborate technique of cutting the diamonds was invented by a Jew. Diamond cutting becomes a new craft, one not subject to guild laws. Vluyenburg, an artificial island on the Amstel, is the centre of Jewish life. Jews of all countries can move about freely here. Nobody's locked up like they were in the ghetto of Venice. On the main street, Jewish refugees from Poland meet Spanish Jews. The painter Rembrandt lived in the middle of the Jewish business quarter. The everyday hustle and bustle outside his front door provided him with numerous motifs and faces. Here they lived on, Spanish Jews in their expensive clothes who paid well for a portrait like The Jewish Bride, commissioned by a rich merchant. Rembrandt gave the poor Polish Jews on his street money to pose for him. He was inspired by their alien rituals, their clothing and culture. He painted them with noticeable sympathy, people who had to suffer so much wretchedness. The Sephardim, the Spanish Jews, considered themselves the representatives of a higher Jewry. They were cultivated, what they thought was the bom Judesmo, worthy Jewry. With condescension, they looked at the unrefined behavior of the Ashkenazi Polish Jews. They set themselves apart from them by calling themselves the elite. In 1675, the synagogue of the Sephardic Jews was consecrated. Its dimensions still give an insight into the power and size of the community. Amsterdam became the Dutch Jerusalem, and finally it was said that Israel was living in safety. The descendants of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, whose families were persecuted and forced to convert to Christianity, prayed here. During the 17th century, the return to the faith of their fathers opened up many questions. Who still knew the old rituals and laws? Decades of being uprooted and living their lives in a Christian environment had buried many old traditions. They adopt the old religion, but they have new questions, such as, how can Jewish religious laws be reconciled with everyday life? The Etz Haim library of the synagogue reflects this search and this doubt. The oldest extant Jewish library in the world shows what the Jewish community was interested in: theological writings, natural sciences and philosophy. It's a collection of the knowledge of the 17th century. In this field of tension between modernity and tradition, a significant philosopher develops his ideas. Baruch Spinoza, also the son of a Spanish immigrant. His writings cause a scandal. In 1656 he's banished from the Amsterdam congregation. What was so shocking about his ideas? In Rinsburg, not far from Amsterdam, Spinoza continues to work on a philosophical treatise. He questions the religious content of Judaism. The Bible isn't a revelation from God, he says, but a story written down by man. With that, Spinoza lays the foundation of modern Bible criticism. His banishment shows, on the one hand, the desire of the community to set limits to the critical questioning of the tradition. On the other hand, it was dangerous in the Calvinistic surroundings of Amsterdam to have in the community a radical Jew like Spinoza who questioned the foundations of faith that were also sacred in the Christian religion. Glickel von Hameln finds a good match for her daughter. Zipporah is married to a Hofjude, a so-called court Jew. He has an influential position at the court of a Christian prince as financial advisor, credit provider and supplier of luxury goods that can't be had without good connections. We had an elegant wedding in Amsterdam like there hadn't been in 100 years. The wedding rings are exchanged. According to Jewish ritual, the pair are now considered married. They drink from one beaker, a symbol of the chalice of life that they will be sharing in the future. It is said to be blessed by God. At the end, the bridegroom must trample the glass in memory of the destruction of the Jewish temple and the fragility of all happiness. Through their influence amongst the powerful in Europe, the court Jews opened the doors to modern Judaism. The descendant of one court Jew, the philosopher Moses Mendelssohn, will demand the emancipation and equal treatment for all Jews. A man on the way up. Moses Mendelssohn, philosopher and Jew. He has studied the history of his people and wants to change its future. Mendelssohn is invited to Sanssouci, a Jew in the palace of the Prussian king Frederick the Great. What do you deal in, Jew? Something you don't have. Reason. Moses Mendelssohn has made a name for himself as a philosopher of the Enlightenment and a worldly thinker. People are reading his writings not only in Germany but in the whole of Europe. It is thanks to this reputation that he was invited to Sanssouci. The Saxon Minister of State, Baron von Fritsch, admires him. He has come to Potsdam to debate with this famous Jew. Mendelssohn uses the interest taken by the statesman to state his political demands. Religious tolerance must be granted to everyone equally, including Jews and Muslims. Let us be human beings amongst human beings. We are entitled to the same rights and duties that any other citizen is entitled to. Baron von Fritsch sees in him the living proof for the fundamental idea of the Enlightenment. All human beings are able to liberate themselves from the shackles of their social circumstances. The meeting takes place right next door to the Prussian king, but he won't receive Jews. The king refuses to admit him into his Academy of Sciences, even though Prussia's greatest thinkers have unanimously voted him into their midst. This recognition is denied him, because he is a Jew. Ambitious and thirsty for knowledge, Mendelssohn had left his parents' home in Dessau when he was only 14, so that he could follow his teacher to the Prussian capital, Berlin. He has to go around half the city in order to enter it, because Jews are only allowed to enter through one particular city gate, the one which Christians use to get their livestock to market. It wasn't the only humiliation that awaited a Jew in Berlin. Prussia only accepts Jews if they can prove that they are wealthy or when they make themselves useful as merchants, moneylenders or physicians. Young Mendelssohn had nothing like that to offer, but he did have the guarantee of his teacher, a so-called protected Jew. With protection letters, Jews were able to buy themselves a limited right of residence and trade in Prussia, in return for a royal fee of 1,000 thalers, a fortune. At that time, 100,000 people lived in Berlin, and amongst them there were just 2,000 Jews. Even those who had managed to establish themselves here could still be banished at any time. In his kingdom, so said the Prussian king, everyone should find salvation in their own way. The exception, the Jewish citizens. Tolerance and fairness weren't for everyone. Most Jews withdrew and lived isolated from the Christian surroundings. They read in Hebrew and spoke Yiddish. Their right to trade is restricted. They're excluded from many professions. Those who are lucky find work in manufacturing businesses founded by a small group of wealthy Jews. Moses Mendelssohn also earns his family's living in a Jewish silk factory. As a bookkeeper, he balances the bills and checks the goods. He called this a tedious business that used up the best years of his life. because he has other plans. As a follower of the Enlightenment, he wants to fight against the oppression of his fellow believers, but that is only possible if they open up and adapt to the society around them. Mendelssohn's ideas meet with great approval amongst many Jews. Mementos of him are still cherished today, like his protective goggles in the Jewish Museum in Berlin. At night, Mendelssohn works like mad on his own writings on religion and philosophy. He also acquires the secular knowledge rejected by the rabbis. Besides Latin, English and French, he also masters the language that hardly any Jew knows, German. Mendelssohn is the first to translate the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, into German. The text is printed in Hebrew letters because they were the only ones most Jews were able to read at that time. Mendelssohn had the purpose in mind to teach the German Jews the German language. That, of course, caused some strong reaction amongst some of the Orthodox rabbis. They said the Bible wasn't allowed to serve as a teaching tool for the German language. But many other German Jews applauded the idea because they did want to participate in German society. So they accepted his Bible translation and his philosophical writings with enthusiasm. Adaptation, yes, but the tradition of the faith had to remain the same. Firmly keeping to one's own religion and participating in the state's public life as a human being and citizen. Both were part of a person's identity, Mendelssohn said, to be an enlightened contemporary and a Jew. He himself was consciously living in 2 worlds. For the Jewish community, he was Moshe from Dessau. That's how his name was written in Yiddish. But in civic life, he remained Moses Mendelssohn. On his suggestion, the first free Jewish schools are created, accessible to every child at no charge, boys and girls. Christian and Jewish children are taught together. They don't just read religious texts. German, nature study and mathematics are all on the curriculum. Moses Mendelssohn is convinced that education is the only path that will lead out of the ghetto of isolation. These new schools that arose towards the end of the 18th century formed the institutional anchorage of the Enlightenment, as it were. Here, a new generation of German Jews developed that was meant to be at home in Jewish tradition, but also in the German language, culture and the secular sciences. Mendelssohn's ideas also find recognition in the Christian spiritual world. Some even want to convert him to Christianity as a logical step in his career. Mendelssohn declines, but those who understood him that way misinterpreted him. He became the leader of the Jewish emancipation in the whole of Europe. He gave many Jews the self-confidence and strength to fight for their rights. And he was successful. Even in his lifetime, his demands were fixed by law. Not in Prussia, but in Austria. The Tolerance Edict of 1781 puts into effect what Mendelssohn demanded as a human right. Jews were now equal citizens. Jews particularly used these chances in Czernowitz on the eastern border of the Habsburg Empire. They helped build the town and assimilate to the German-speaking culture oriented towards Vienna. Around 1900, more than 1/3 of the population was Jewish. A Jewish Nationalhaus, a kind of cultural center, is the expression of the newly found self-confidence. The tombstones in the Jewish cemetery reflect the social advancement. Lawyers, bank directors and professors. There was even a Jewish mayor. And there was Yiddish, the very own language of the Eastern European Jews. The Czernowitz Jews were vigorously demanding its official recognition. These days, only a few still keep Yiddish alive, such as the author Joseph Berg and the leader of the Jewish congregation. The ring of their voices is like a distant echo of a once rich Jewish culture in Eastern Europe. Joseph Berg lives in the Jewish quarter of Czernowitz. He remembers the more than 60 synagogues and houses of worship that used to be here. But little of this has survived National Socialism and communism. The Jews of Czernowitz meet every morning for their service. Many that pray here have only managed to survive through happy coincidences. Not far from Czernowitz, on the other side of the Dnieper River, the land used to be part of Russia. Here the cold breath of the great, hostile Tsarist empire drifts across, wrote the Jewish author Joseph Roth. A different world on the distant riverbank, and also different conditions for Jews. At the end of the 18th century, the Tsar conquered large parts of Poland. That was where the majority of the Eastern European Jews were living. But the Tsar did not want them in his heartland, so he forbade the Jews to leave their living areas. Here, the author Mary Antin grew up towards the end of the 19th century before she emigrated to the United States with her family. In her books, she wrote about the everyday lives of Jews in the Tsarist Empire. I was a prisoner. The shackles had grown familiar to my flesh. Even as a young girl, she entrusted her diary with her experiences, fears, and hopes. Mary Antin's hometown of Polotsk lies in modern-day Lithuania. Jews were living amongst themselves here without rights, oppressed and often persecuted by their Christian neighbours. Time and again her parents warned Mary and her sisters to beware of the Christians. Christian holidays were particularly dangerous for Jews, Mary remembered. Passover was a time of horror for the Jews. Somebody would start up that lie about murdering Christian children, and the stupid peasants would get mad about it and fill themselves with vodka and set out to kill the Jews. They attacked them with knives and axes, killed them or tortured them and burned their houses. Again and again there were gruesome pogroms in the Tsarist Empire. This label for the anti-Jewish riots originated in Russia. The Gentiles were going to tear me in pieces with axes and knives and ropes. They were going to burn me alive. The cross, what would they do to me first? The Tsar was the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. As protector of the true Christian faith, he was openly hostile towards Judaism. For the solution of the Jewish question, a rule of thumb was proposed. A third of Jews should convert, another third should emigrate, and the final third should starve. In the mid-19th century, 5 million Jews were living in the area assigned to them. Pent up like in a huge ghetto, they banded together in their own villages and neighborhoods. Just as in Letichev in modern-day Ukraine, only the old remember that until the 1940s nearly all the inhabitants were Jewish. In Yiddish, the Jews called their neighborhoods shtetl, little towns, small islands in an ocean of followers of a different religion. Jews were not allowed to work as peasants in the Tsarist Empire, but they were allowed to be craftsmen. Because more and more people moved into a shtetl, every village had 10 coppersmiths, cobblers or tailors. But despite the poverty and the lack of space, the external threat was unifying. In the historical archive of Kamenez-Podolsky in modern-day Ukraine, mounds of manuscripts document the anti-Jewish laws of the Tsars. Since the end of Soviet times, a start has been made on evaluating them. One law was particularly inhumane. It forced Jewish boys to serve in the army. The military lists document that even 14- and 15-year-olds were conscripted. Under some Tsars, they had to serve for 25 years. The Jewish communities had to organize the recruitment themselves. Some sent out kappa, kidnappers. The parents knew that hell awaited their sons, and if they were to ever see them again, then only as strangers who no longer knew or understood their Jewish home anymore. For 300 rubles, the parents could ransom the little recruits. A fortune. Some families pawned their livestock or even their home and farm. Parents who couldn't afford that went to the extreme limits of the imaginable. They mutilated their sons, cut off their fingers and toes in order to save them from the Tsar's army. They did all that to prevent their children being alienated from their Jewish faith and their culture with brutal violence. Thus the Jews in the Tsarist Empire experienced oppression and suffering right from their childhood. Only their faith provided support and comfort. In moments when their wretchedness was greatest, it wakened new strength. Through the longing for closeness to God, a new religious movement gained more and more followers. Hasidism. Soon there were men with long beards, kaftans and fur hats in every shtetl. They called themselves the pious, the Hebrew word for which is chasidut. The closed world of the shtetl was breaking up. Some searched for support in their inner faith, others decided to flee from poverty and oppression. Like Mary Antin and her family, they wanted to risk a new beginning. Shipping agencies began advertising a new promised land across the great ocean, America. The father, Israel Antin, made the move there in order to build up a new existence for his family. Only then did he want to bring his family over. Mary had been waiting for this time for 3 years. Finally, her father sent the tickets for the crossing. A quiet and secret farewell had been planned, but the news spread quickly around the village. Mary and her mother were giving up their friendships, traditions, and their familiar world in the hope of exchanging them against freedom and prosperity. Just like the Antin family, 2 million Russian Jews left towards the end of the 19th century. They were part of a great wave of emigration, and they all had the same destination, America. The Statue of Liberty stood at the turning point between the nightmares of the past and the hope for a new world. After a 3-week journey, Mary, her mother and her sisters reached their destination. First stop was the Immigration Hall in Boston. Mary hadn't seen her father for 3 years. Would she recognize him? Before their reunion, the official asked scrutinizing questions. Were the new citizens healthy and able to work? Who was going to care for them? Many Jewish immigrants saw the new beginning as an opportunity to break with old traditions. America became the new center for Jews. The immigrants came from villages in Eastern Europe into a modern metropolis. They had to get by on casual labor as day laborers, rag pickers and peddlers. They had no education or property and did not speak English. Most lived in so-called tenements, apartment blocks with small flats. Large families had to share a 2-room apartment. Many worked as tailors, a trade they'd learned in Russia. The work from home only earned them a few cents. Wages fell because the influx of cheap labor cut the prices. The Jewish women helped support their families and let go of their traditional roles. They fought in trade unions against bad working conditions. They wanted a better life for their children, education and a social climb out of the slums. For many devout Jews, there is only one promised land. Eretz Israel, the biblical land of their forefathers. The hope of a return has always stayed alive. During the 19th century, Jerusalem was under the rule of the Ottoman Turks. After Mount Zion, synonymous with the city and the country, the Jewish settlers called themselves Zionists. Many of them were intellectuals. They wanted to realize the new human in the promised land, so they said. Instead of studying the Bible, they rolled up their sleeves, dried out marshes and planted trees. For a long time, they hadn't been allowed to work on the fields. Spades and hoes now became the embodiment of a self-determined life. This man made a political program out of their vision and a uniform movement out of different groups. This man was Theodor Herzl. His parents were assimilated Jews from Budapest. Religion played next to no role. Theodor Herzl was working as a correspondent for the Wiener Freie Presse in Paris. France fascinated him, the country in which the Jews had enjoyed legal equality since the French Revolution. Many held important positions in the government and economy, but still there were deep-rooted prejudices against Jews in society. The drama in the military academy in Paris opened Herzl's eyes. In 1894, the Jewish officer Alfred Dreyfus was accused of alleged espionage for Germany. A military tribunal sentenced him to lifelong banishment without having sound proof. He was publicly cashiered. Again and again Dreyfus swore his innocence. Many weren't interested in that. He was a Jew and therefore guilty. Even the serious press wrote, "Death to the Jew, death to the Judas." The trial split the country. Theodor Herzl observed the affair. Anti-Semitic outbreaks in an enlightened country, in the top levels of society in Europe on the brink of a new century. This was the crucial experience for him. In his newspaper articles, he pointed out the inconsistencies. He was convinced of the innocence of the Jewish officer. With this opinion, he was in the minority. The court documents of the affair are in the military archive in Paris. It was to take 12 years before Alfred Dreyfus was rehabilitated in a new trial. In 1906, the evidence that led to his conviction was exposed as forgeries. Theodor Herzl was right with his assumption. The Dreyfus affair was simply an expression of anti-Jewish sentiment in France. He was convinced that there was no safe place for Jews in Europe. "Assimilate yourselves, then you'll do better," people called out to us with pathos, and we did. Except for our noses, we forgot our own customs and neglected our own culture. What good did it do us? In the eyes of the people, we remained Jews. And that doesn't just mean believers in the Jewish faith, but also sons of a different tribe. Only on their own soil could the Jewish people freely create its fate. Herzl wrote a book in which he outlined his vision. He called it The Jewish State. Just 1 year later, Herzl convenes a Jewish Congress in Basel. 200 men and women, selected delegates from 24 countries, respond to his invitation. Rabbis, students, merchants and professors, they decide to set up a program for the advancement of Jewish settlement and for the formation of a protected home in Eretz Israel. Herzl was convinced that Arabs and Jews could live there in peace together. And so Basel became an arena of world history. After the Congress, Theodor Herzl noted in his diary, "In Basel I founded the Jewish state. If I were to say that out loud today, I would be met with universal laughter. But in 5 years, and definitely in 50, everyone will accept it." In a novel, The Old New Land, Herzl designed an image of a peaceful modern Jewish state. If you really want it, it won't be a fairy tale, but it's a long way from fairy tale to political reality. It took another half a century until the United Nations approved the creation of a Jewish state in a part of Palestine. On the 14th of May 1948, David Ben-Gurion proclaims the founding of the State of Israel. The Star of David on a blue and white background, the symbol of the Zionists, became the flag of the Jewish nation. In those days, just as today, far from all Jews shared Herzl's enthusiasm for their own state. In the Berlin of the turn of the century, many Jews looked optimistically to the future. The city was flourishing economically and culturally, a symbol of a new age, a modern age for Jews too. 2/3 of all German Jews were living on the banks of the Spree. The majority had become assimilated. Together with their Jewish dress, they also laid aside their strict rites and their Yiddish language. The Great Berlin Synagogue is an expression of the new self-confidence and a feeling of security. Now the synagogues lay on the main roads and, not like in the past, in hidden backyards. Everywhere in Germany, Jewish houses of worship were built in the late 19th century style. Most were destroyed in the Third Reich. But even in their restored splendor, they allow the imagination to see what German Jews once meant to Germany. It was in those days that Reformed Judaism arose, liberal and cosmopolitan. Men and women were now praying and singing together. The rabbi wore a black gown and preached in German. The feeling was no longer one of being a Jew in Germany, but that of being a German Jew. 1914, the outbreak of World War I. Karl Wolf, the son of a Jewish merchant, enlists voluntarily. This mission is linked with a special hope for him, as it is for many Jews. "I go to war as a German so that I may protect my threatened fatherland, but also as a Jew, so that I may fight for the complete equality of my fellow believers." Jews are important physicians, artists and business people, but access to the elites is not permitted them. 1.3 million Germans register for the general mobilization. Amongst them are 100,000 Jews. These are photographs of Karl Wolf taken during the war. He experienced camaraderie between Jewish and Christian soldiers. The fight against a common enemy united them. His photo album has survived the times. His son, Paul Wolf, managed to save it and take it to the United States. His father's hopes of recognition remained unfulfilled. While thousands are dying on the front, the Reich government carries out a census of the Jews that had enlisted. It is meant to expose the German Jews as shirkers. The statistics show the opposite, and for that reason it remains under lock and key. The medals for bravery are a weak consolation for the disappointment of the Jewish soldiers. Karl Wolf and many others felt betrayed by the country for which they had risked their lives. My father was, as far as I could tell from our discussion, felt mainly German at the beginning of World War I, much more German than Jewish. Powerful forces in German society did not accept this self-image. Caricatures on seaside postcards. Jews weren't wanted here. Some beach pools advertised being Jew-free. The Jewish citizens were strangers in their own country. Anti-Jewish depictions in German everyday life were perfectly respectable. The more Jews assimilated, the more fervently many looked for new arguments to hate them. Anti-Jewish sentiment turned into anti-Semitism. They were not presented as a religious community anymore, but as an inferior race or foreign nation. Being a Jew became an inescapable fate. If one were to define anti-Semitism, I'd say that it's the idea that Jews were a tightly connected group with several negative characteristics that harm the societies in which they live for their personal benefit, and that they do this in secret. That's really important. They don't act openly. They can't be fought openly. Everything happens secretly, and the anti-Semite is just a person who exposes it. After World War I, Germany was in a sorry state. Injured national pride and an economic crisis provided fertile ground for radical groups. They put anti-Semitism on their agenda. A scapegoat was needed. The Jews were to blame for the lost war and were profiting from the German suffering. In 1933, the National Socialists came to power. They began immediately to put their anti-Semitic program into effect. A boycott of all Jewish shops, racial laws, job prohibitions and dispossession. By now, Karl Wolf was the father of 3 children. Like many Jews, he believed that National Socialism was merely a temporary phenomenon and that his children were safe in Germany. On November the 9th, 1938, reality catches up with the Wolf family too. The stormtroopers come to pick up Karl Wolf. Erika Wolf is home alone with her children. Her husband is visiting his brother-in-law. The brown shirts aren't interested in her husband's war decorations. His achievements provide no protection. Karl Wolf is found just a short while later and sent to a concentration camp. In that same night, synagogues all over Germany are set on fire. Jewish shops are plundered, 3,000 Jews are taken to camps and hundreds are murdered. When the SS came and picked him up in the Kristallnacht, he spent 3 weeks in prison, I think. He was let go because he had papers from World War I, but that was a wake-up call for him. He realized that he had to quickly collect his things and emigrate with his family. In April 1939, the Nazis harass the Wolf family for the last time. They want to make sure that the wealthy family aren't taking any valuables with them. But the Wolf family want just one thing: a safe life in the United States. There, an uncle had vouched for them. Paul Wolf was 9 years old. He had to watch how his parents' possessions were confiscated. Paul wanted to save at least something from his family's possessions. He decided to keep a crystal vase from the Nazis. Without the gold border, it looked worthless, so he hoped. These days, this vase has a place of honor in his living room in the United States. 6 million Jews were brutally murdered. An incomprehensible number. 6 million destinies. The Yad Vashem Memorial in Jerusalem commemorates the victims with photographs, personal mementos and letters. Yad Vashem means in English, memorial and a name, after the words of the prophet Isaiah. Unto them will I give in my house and within my walls a memorial and a name better than of sons and of daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off.